Good morning, and it's a great pleasure to share another story following Professor Kailath, who, of course, been my mentor and guide for more than 30 years. So it's a privilege to share the stage with him and to talk to our friends in Korea about, again, I think I would say no equations at all, maybe even less equations than Professor Kailath, about my own, interest in wireless communications and what I did and share with you some perspectives. My own background was really, for many years, I was in the Indian Navy, actually in uniform, and I used to build sonar systems. And initially I did a PhD, and Professor Kailath was helped me with that. And I did some very interesting work. I would say very advanced mathematics of measure theory and stochastic calculus, but I gave it all up and became a totally practical engineer for 20 years. And then after I came back to Stanford, I began to learn a little bit of mathematics. And so my view of maths has always been to always look at problems completely in my through pictures, solve them in my mind, and then try and put the mathematics behind them. So I'm not really a mathematician. I'm really just an engineer. So in any case, let me begin. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little about where wireless is going, and then talk about my own story there. So essentially, if you look at 2009, 2010, there are probably about 1.5 billion internet users around the world, and probably well above, I think, 3 billion users of mobile subscribers. I think India and China has been the big spot. And these two, the mobile phones and internet access, are now colliding, and all future systems are going to become mobile internet. And a huge opportunity, and Korea has been a dominant country here, and Samsung and LG are major players. And my own company has a very formidable competitor in Korea called GCT. So it's a very strong. I think Korea has done extremely well in wireless. I'm involved with the project at Stanford, and we're looking at what's going to happen 2020, but a dozen years from now. And most of this has already happened. All services will be IP based. It's all packet services. So I think we're almost there now. In fact, WiMAX now today provides pretty good voice, IP based voice, wireless voice. It's quite hard to make it work, but it works fairly well now. And I think our access to desktop PCs will reduce, and essentially the internet access will go to your shirt pocket. You will do a lot of your work from your shirt pocket. There's a lot of new technology needed to make it convenient, but I think that will happen. I see a lot of them already happening. And in fact, I think the iPhone was really the first breakthrough of moving the internet into your shirt pocket, and a lot more will happen over the next 12 years. But when that happens, I think we need a lot of new architectures for data, computing, and security, because today you're happy to keep your files on your desktop, but you may not want to keep it on your shirt pocket, because you lose your phone, you lose everything. So cloud computing, a lot of other things will happen. So there's going to be lots of innovations over here to support a shirt pocket internet access. And of course, I think certainly we'll need a very enhanced PHY performance. And so just looking at PHY, where PHY is today, for 3G, typically the peak megabits, you look at release 3.0, 3.4, 4.0, 1.1 megabit peak. Spectral efficiency, bits per hertz per cell, was about half a 0.5. And round-trip delay time was about 200 milliseconds. Now, 4G, which is where WiMAX is, and LTE will happen soon over the next few years. We're now talking about 10 megabits peak. Actually, it's more. We can get 40 megabits peak at the base station. And per terminal today, at least my chipset, BSeam chipset, I think we have shown 30 megabits peak per terminal. So it's very fast. Spectral efficiency is around 2.5, which now, depending on what conditions you cook up for it. And round-trip delay times are about 20 milliseconds. The next step is going to be IMT Advanced, which is an ITU concept. And they were talking about per terminal 100 megabits peak. It's pretty fast. And the spectral efficiency, bits per hertz per cell of 7.5. Already 2.5 is pretty tough. This is going to be really tough. And round-trip delay time down to 5 milliseconds. By 2018, 2020, we're going to talk about per terminal throughputs of 1 gigabit per second, and spectral efficiency is 12.5 bits per second per hertz, and round-trip delay time for about 2 milliseconds. All these are really big challenges. In fact, from where we are today here, how you're going to get there is not very clear, because I think there are lots of obstacles, so plenty of research problems. So higher speed, improved spectral efficiency, lower delay, better QFS, better coverage, all these are going to happen. So with that, let me get into talk about MIMO. So MIMO is, of course, a hugely important idea. It has two aspects to it. One is the so-called spatial multiplexing idea, where you can actually send multiple parallel streams through the same frequency channel and create new spectrum. Another idea was, of course, diversity, where just because there are so many cross links, each of the links may actually fade and have a lot of fading. If you can somehow code things properly, you could actually use the independent fading across these links to compress the amount of fading ultimately. So that's called diversity factor. So diversity and multiplexing are the two key ideas of MIMO, and it's a big part of modern wireless. So let me tell you about how I got involved and into this whole area. So I joined. I visited Stanford in 1984-85 at Professor Kailath's invitation, and then I went back and I was supposed to head up building a combat aircraft for India, but somehow around 1991 I wrote back to Professor Kailath saying that can I come back to US, and he graciously agreed. I came back and I was working along with a couple of other doctoral students, trying to do something. I was, hoping I'll be eventually appointed at Stanford. And I was parked with a professor called Professor Gene Golub, who passed away, and he had a DARPA program for airborne surveillance. Idea there was an aircraft would fly over in the air, and they would see many emitters coming up, and they all be co-channel. Then they would, of course, interfere, and you can't listen to any of them. So the idea was, could you use an antenna array and separate these incoming signals coming from different directions from the ground and separate them. And so we were looking at different ideas how to do this, and the work was actually done in part at Argo Systems. And the question was, when you want to separate the signals, this box had to have some idea how to do it. And one approach was in some sense, the box had to find out what are the signatures spatially of this and this emitter. That's a different, because they're same in frequency band. So they had to find some differentiation in space. And one approach was called MT-MORE, and that was developed by a very bright engineer called Brian Agee. And that said was, if these signals were constant modulus signals, then that leverage could be exploited by some nonlinear techniques, bus gang idea and all that, to actually form a filter here which would pass this signal into that port and kill this one, and vice versa. And there's another example, another approach to the problem was SPI, which uses a different idea. And we were looking at both of these, and actually I was, for some reasons, was skeptical of SPI, but let me tell you about that. So the SPI algorithm actually came around in 1985. I was at Stanford, and when I came to Stanford, Professor Kailath told me to think about a new algorithm developed by somebody called Ralph Schmidt in the Silicon Valley. And the algorithm was called Music. It's a beautiful idea where you would extract some underlying subspace from the data, and you had some calibration information called a manifold. The intersection of the subspace and the manifold was the solution. Very neat idea. Involved some linear algebra, which I didn't know anything about, but I came back and I learned it at Stanford. But before I came to Stanford, I had built a very large sonar system in India, which is still being used. And there we were, for a variety of reasons, we would find the direction of arrival of an emitter by steering a null towards. So the best way, actually, it turns out you steer a beam and you look for the peak of the beam. But that would be a very shallow response. And because of the display processing, we would actually steer a null and look for a deep loss of signal level. And that was how we picked it up. So this was in my mind when I was at Stanford, and I knew that the nulling was a nice idea, but it was not clear how it would work. But if you have many signals coming at you, which is the standard problem those days, if you steer a null towards one signal, there will still be other signals coming in, so the power will not drop. So we're looking for something else which would drop when the signal disappeared. And I was keeping many things in my mind until one day around 2 o'clock in the morning, early morning, this idea finally struck, and SPI came out of it. And the idea there was it required 2 antenna arrays which would be identical, unknown but identical, which is a plus and a minus. And then you would have planar signal. It had to be planar, signal arriving. And it turns out that if this signal hits this array, it would go and hit the array a little later with a phase shift of phi. And if you can find this phase shift phi, you know the direction of arrival of the signal, because you know this baseline and you can find out the direction. So it turns out that, I won't go into the mathematics, but if you take this data from the X and Y subarrays, and you extract from them 2 submatrices, EXX, EXY, which very much look like what came out of the Riccati, out of the Wien-Hopf equation, and then you solve a generalized signal, generalized eigenproblem, where Z are the eigenvectors, generalized eigenvectors, and phi are the eigenvalues. It turns out when you solve this problem with these estimated matrices, which came out of the data, the answer came out. The phis were the directions of arrival, and Z's were an interesting vector. It turns out the Z vector would be the vector we applied across here, would actually pass this desired the signal belonging to phi and kill everything else. It was a nulling vector. So I knew this. And so we're back in 1991, when I was at Stanford, we were looking at seeing whether the fact that if you could actually use this array and form 2 subarrays which look identical, you could do that. It doesn't work because of mutual coupling, but somehow it is approximate. But the fact they were potentially planar, they were not quite planar, you could actually use the SPI nulling vector idea to do this problem. So we're looking at this also. And of course, in general, it turned out that the SPI didn't work very well. And this experiments were partly done at Argo, but someday we did it at Durand Building, where some of you know Stanford, know where that was. Actually, Professor Kailath was sitting, and I was sitting in a postdoc room. And typically what we would find is that if you have the signals well apart, we actually doctored 2, those days, 900 megahertz cordless phones to provide the signal, and we would talk into it. And we had jury-rigged a small algorithm running on a machine developed at Argo Systems, actually, to separate the signals. And this had lots of problems. It's something called port switching. What will happen is we can hear this voice on this guy, but suddenly it'll go to another port. And because this was only using the constant modulus feature to do the separation. And since there was some fading going on, the algorithm really didn't work very well. But if the signals came close together, when the 2 observers came close, it would not separate. So there was a guard regions where the guys couldn't get closer to each other, just walk around, and it would not separate. And that was it. So one day it rained. I think it was probably January 1991. And we took this array, instead of being out at Durand, we took it into the lobby of Durand Building. And after the rain was over, we did another experiment, just lazy, didn't take it out. And we found suddenly that these 2 sources could actually be next to each other and could separate them. And that was a remarkable idea. And of course, it's very unstable. It hardly worked. And then I sort of vaguely said must be multipath, and we sort of forgot about it. But it was interesting that it actually had happened. And maybe about 2 weeks later, I was having a haircut, and I realized that if I could, since these could actually work from next to each other, you could actually put those 2 transmitters on the same device. I could send 2 streams, and you could separate them. Then, in fact, you could actually maybe you can create spatial multiplexing, and so that's how the idea came, and we filed a patent, Professor Kailath, myself, and then two of us filed a patent on this in 1992. And of course, at that time I knew the throughput was of this form, but I never actually went into details and wrote it down properly. I didn't have enough knowledge of information theory to work through all the details, which later Telakar did some few years later. So that is how the idea of spatial multiplexing came to me. And I had thought a lot about how multipath interacts. So when this happened, I could figure out what was going on. What really happened was because of multipath, the induced signal at this array, if there was no multipath, would look planar, and these two guys sitting over here will be almost identical, and no way it would have worked. But because this signal was bouncing off multipath, they would in fact have very different signatures, and that's how the whole thing was working. So I was clear it was working well. But, and that's how we find the pattern. But of course, I could see that it was very, very unstable. We were using FM signals for these cordless phones, and I was very biased. I never knew that, never believed that this was really a viable idea. Certainly we knew that if you take these two antennas and move them far apart, it will always work fairly well. So I was very biased against this close ideas and thought further ideas would be a better idea. So when we wrote a patent, we said, let's do something where that would work, and that was the broadcast idea. Idea was, those days, the cellular world was still in the analog area, but broadcast was doing HDTV, the digital system. So we said, why not we actually take a broadcast signal, take it to 2 or 3 towers, and they will be far apart, it will always work, and then you can get 3 times the capacity. So actually, Professor Kailath asked, and me and Richard Roy went to meet the people in Washington, D.C. to propose the idea, but a bit late for their standards, so never paid attention to it. I recently discovered a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the BBC in Europe has a big program looking at this idea for broadcast now, many years later. Okay, so now basically after this, we filed a patent, nothing much happened. And I'll tell you why it didn't happen. Partly was my responsibility. I had sort of assumed, I was very skeptical of SM because I assumed it must work all the time. It turns out it does not work all the time. Today, we go to we take a BSEAM chipset, or you go to even WiMAX, you'll find that the spatial multiplexing idea, the channel supports it sometime, does not support some other time. So what you normally do is, whenever it supports it, you do spatial multiplexing. If it does not, you go to the diversity mode. So, but I was stuck with saying that it won't be reliable if it can't be used. Answer was, that is not the right way to look at it. Use it when you can, and don't use it when you cannot. So that was a mindset which was wrong. The second thing was, I was very focused on the AMP system, which was the analog system those days. And I said, AMPs was giving a voice call to a phone. What's the point in having 2 voice calls? It doesn't make any sense. So it didn't seem very, very relevant. And also, AMPs didn't have any pilots. So in order to be able to understand these signatures, you have to have pilots to learn the channel. AMPs had no pilots, and we were using a nonlinear phenomena of constant modulus, which is not a stable way of doing things. So that also biased me very much against saying, can this really work? And of course, I never wrote up rigorous analysis and explained the idea properly. So I was certainly responsible for the fact that it never took off for many, many years. And of course, I also had some other difficulties. We actually proposed this to DARPA, and some reason they did not like the idea. I still remember meeting with somebody called Colonel Crowley, was it Crowley? And I explained this to him about how this could be used in, I think, in satellites and all that. And only 2 weeks ago, I saw a BAA from DOD looking at the same problem 18 years later, saying, can we do this now? So DARPA would not pay attention. But Stanford, for some reason, was very interested in this patent. And there was a young woman called Berensky who invited about 15 companies, or I don't know whether Samsung was there. They all came, and I presented the idea. But I actually, created a problem for myself. I sort of said, if you have, say, 7 or 8 antennas of this type, you can create a billion QAM system. Because even if you start off with 64 QAM, with 5 antennas, you would have a billion QAM. And somebody from Motorola got up and said, Paul, we can't even make 4 QAM work. You're talking about a billion QAM. Everybody laughed. So, that certainly put me off, because everybody said that must be totally foolish. And I actually went to the venture capital, but they properly realized that there's no product here in the next 3-4 years, so they would not fund it. So for many years, I think I paid very little attention to it afterwards, and actually went on to looking at other problems. And really, in some sense, the So many others contributed to the evolution of MIMO spatial multiplexing. But of course, there was another element to which I did not pay attention to, which is equally important, was the diversity part. Of course, receive diversity, was already known to Marconi. But transport diversity, it took 50 years from Marconi's original ideas of receive diversity to get some attention. And somebody called Wittneben, who works now at ETH, proposed some ideas about it, early ideas about it. And I was not, I think, aware in 1991 of his ideas. But then it took another 6-7, by 1997, Seshadri, Tarok, and Calderbank proposed something called the Spacetime trellis codes, which also did proposed how we can do transmit diversity. But the really fundamental breakthrough in this area was Alamuti, who's now at Intel, and he came up with Alamuti code, which is named after him, and is today an essential part of every MIMO system. Now, of course, the real analysis, all this came out of Bell Labs. Telatar was there at that time, Gans, Tuskini, there are many others, who wrote some very fundamental papers explaining how all this works. And when it came back to channel model, how does MIMO actually work? We actually, around 1997 or so, built some equipment, jury rigged something, did some models, and it's called the SUI model. It's now fairly well known. Stanford University interim models for MIMO systems. We made some measurements and wrote it down, and industry still uses those. Bell Labs did a lot of work, Ronaldo, Venezuela. And then when IOSPAN was formed in 1998, we did a lot of measurements. When I formed IOSPAN in 1998, I was still skeptical whether MIMO will work in the cellular world. I was almost sure it won't work. In fact, our first location was in Menlo Park. We did some experiments. It did not work. Indoors, it worked beautifully. We had an experiment indoors, and because of scattering, it worked well. Outdoors, it didn't seem to work. But finally, when we moved into I think it was in Santa Clara location, we started lots of measurements with real base stations. Then we found actually it works 30-40% of the time. And that's the time it became very clear to me that MIMO was a cellular technology. Spatial multiplexing. And I think IOSPAN also did some very interesting thing was we actually married OFDMA and MIMO together. Earlier, in fact, I was to consult with Qualcomm, Dr. Kailath introduced me to Dr. Viterbi, and I was telling Professor Dr. Viterbi about this idea, but somehow he always linked it with CDMA, because Qualcomm would not let go of CDMA. And CDMA and MIMO don't work very well because MIMO needs to have a channel knowledge, and channel knowledge is a function of frequency. In CDMA, you cannot break it up. It's one spread, so you can do it, but it's very complicated. So CDMA MIMO was a dead letter, and it's only with I think IOSPAN we realized this combination was really the magic combination, and then I think the fact that we showed it worked, and this really took off. But
didn't Qualcomm finally acquire Flareon?
Yeah, but Flareon again never did MIMO. I think Qualcomm never, understood MIMO till they launched their own program in 2005 for UMB program. That's the time, I think, mainly, I would say, to my students. A lot of my students were there. Dhananjay Gore, Hemant, Gaurav Kauf. I think they probably convinced Qualcomm that this is how it should go. But, Flareon was really a flash OFDM there's no MIMO in it.
I thought there was a lot of OFDMA.
OFDMA, yeah. But the combination of MIMO and OFDMA, that Qualcomm, I think, would never understand or would never accept, despite all my attempts to make them do it. But it's only 2005, I think they really said, okay, this is the way to go. So UMB was purely an OFDMA MIMO system, UMB. But IOSPAN, this technology was too ahead of its time, and there was no standard, and there's no way we could really sell in big way. So Intel bought the company, and then took the team and then pushed these ideas into WiMAX. So WiMAX standard came from Intel, and it came from I think what IOSPAN did. I think this was its launch of MIMO OFDMA into which is now going to dominate all future wireless, really came, I think, from the IOSPAN world. So then standards, WiMAX 16E took it up and standardized it. Wi-Fi 11N followed a little later, but actually they hit the market earlier than, because this is, Wi-Fi was already well established, 11N was easy to do, so they hit the market a little earlier than WiMAX. And LTE will be there in 3 or 4 years from now. So by now, about 300 million MIMO devices have been shipped to date. This is a number I got from Broadcom. And I think by another 5 years, more than 1 billion devices using MIMO will be there. So it will become a huge success. Okay. I'll talk more about, about some of the issues later, about the politics of this later. Okay, so, it works very well. This is some plot I got out of BSeam. So we get, basically if you go ahead, you can actually double the throughput. WiMAX today is a 2x2 system. And we can, like in IOSpan, we can support around 10 bits per hertz per subcarrier, because we have 64 QAM, rate 5/6, you get 5 bits per hertz, and this multiplying 2, you get 10. And it works typically in most VM, at least 30-40% of the time. And if it doesn't work, you go back to the link adaptation, you go back to this thing, to diversity mode. Okay, so let's talk about research areas in MIMO. Let's make some brief comments. And there have been some very surprises here. In fact, originally when I talked about thing, I thought antennas have to be miles away, if not a foot. In fact, when we probably got it to work, we made it work in front of Duran building. We used to bring them about a foot apart. And that was 900 megahertz. A foot was probably half lambda, 1/3 lambda. But today, we make it work at 1/16 lambda. So it's incredible. But how it happens is still a puzzle to me, but I'll tell you more about it. So there are a number of issues about antenna design, number of antennas, space-time codes, receiver design. I'm sure many of you work in all these areas, pilots, virtualization, link adaptation, and so on and so forth. So antenna design. Of course, traditionally antennas for handsets had many other issues involved. They're looking at antenna gain, it had to be omnidirectional because you don't know where the handset will point. So there were a number of driving factors, but the new factors in MIMO performance. So how does MIMO capacity actually work, and how does MIMO actually work? So you actually look at different antenna designs and then plot the CDF of capacity and see which one is better. So there are a lot of new factors coming here, and some many big surprises here actually. Then also some worries about mutual coupling, which can hurt or help. But mutual coupling is usually bad from the point of view of transmit. When you transmit, what happens, mutual coupling causes, if you're doing space-time codes versus beamforming, there's lots of interaction between power amplifiers, and they don't like that. So there are many issues over there. And broadbandedness. When antennas are very small, due to the Q Harrington limit, they get high Q, hard to tune them, so making the broadband is not easy, efficiency. And spur rejection is a big problem which I got recently involved with. Either when you have a USB dongle, or even if you have an embedded card in a laptop, there's lots of noise on these systems, and these antennas pick it up. And these spurs are very hard to get rid of. You do a lot of very complicated things to get rid of spurs. The question is, can antennas be designed to sort of reject the spurs coming off the laptop? So there's a lot of work to be done there. So there's a whole lot of issues over here. Let me touch on a few of these. Maybe. So here is an example. For example, this is a Sprint dongle using BSeam chipset. And here is the reference design from BSeam. And here's the antenna. This is actually an antenna from, I think, from Skyworks. I'm not sure. I mean, something like that. And it's only the two antennas are only 1 centimeter apart. Lambda is about 10 centimeters. Already 1/10 lambda. We have designs at 1/16 lambda. And this is, for example, a MIMO, base station antennas. This is the main branch and the diversity branch. Typically here, you would have, half lambda or 1/3 lambda spacing. So actually, if you look at the beam patterns of the dongle, you would find that actually the beams actually seem to look away from each other. And here at 1/10 lambda, for example, we plot, these are probably measurements made in the lab, or I'm not sure they're made outside, but you find the two antennas are pretty uncorrelated, even though they are much less than 1/10 lambda. Actually, if we go back to the Jake's theory of scattering, and the correlation function is a Bessel function of J zero order. At 0.1 lambda spacing, the correlation should be 0.92 or 0.93, but actually they're pretty uncorrelated. So
the antennas not identical though.
They are actually one metal. If you look at the antennas, they're joined together as one metal piece, but they're fed at different points, and they are mirror image each other.
But the geometric shape, are they identical?
Yeah, in fact, they are mirror image, and they are in fact one piece of metal. They are actually physically, electrically joined, but they're fed at two different points, and that causes some good MIMO performance. There are other antennas we use called metamaterial antennas. Metamaterials, I don't know, anybody who knows metamaterials? This was developed by a Russian scientist some years ago, 1940s. Like many things, the Russians were behind it. But then there's been a lot of work where you can get negative index of, permittivity and permeability by some by some arrays of using slotted circular antennas and dipoles. I don't know the theory very well. But there are some antennas which are probably overhyped, which also we've been investigating in this. But all I can say is this is that, and I can't get too much into it, there's some proprietary stuff here, but the whole area of antenna has been a total surprise to me. I thought that we could barely get to, for example, here we're using, these are probably 2.5 gigahertz, so the lambda is about maybe a little more, 12, 13 centimeters. I'd never imagined we could have got antenna less than 4 or 5 centimeters. We're less than 1 centimeter today. And I think we can go much less than that. So the underlying physics, for me, I don't understand it properly. I don't know if even BCM understands it. We work with some vendors, but this is an area where there's full of possibilities to look at. And lots of new electromagnetic theories needed to understand what's going on. So that's been a total surprise to me as how well these things work. There's many more things to antennas. I wouldn't go into it. I won't have the time. Let me talk also maybe about another area that I'm sure all of you have contributed here, and a fascinating area, and that was space-time codes. And of course, the Alamuti code was a really beautiful idea. I wish I've always told Shiva, I wish I wrote that paper. Such a beautiful idea. And of course, and it's still stuck. I mean, it's anytime you build a MIMO system, one code you'll obviously use, or two things you'll use. You'll use spatial multiplexing, you use Alamuti code. That is always the mother of all things. And then, there's been some understanding of how these codes should be developed, and there was, the researchers at Berkeley proposed some ideas about asymptotic frontiers of spatial multiplexing and diversity, and they said, how should codes be constructed? Really, but at low SNRs, there's no good theory, but I think Narasimhan at USC in US, Santa Cruz has done some work, I think, actually sitting at Chaffee's group. So there's some understanding of what code should look like. But the key things which I keep focusing on is we have no idea, so we have some idea how to build code which are both multiplexing and diversity optimal. But the most important thing is they have to be easy to decode. And decodability is very, very important. For example, in WiMAX standard, there's a code called the golden code, which is actually optimal from this point of view, but it's very hard to decode. So decoding is very, very important. So there's been lots of, in fact, BCM and Stanford has contributed some new codes in WiMAX standard, which try to balance this and decodability. Still an area which I think needs more work. Lattice codes tend to be known now to be optimal from this point of view. They use lots of algebra which I don't understand, called Clifford algebras and things like that. But it's an area I would not say is fully exhausted. I think there's still work to be done today, because most of us are using 2x2 systems. We're all sort of not really cracked this problem open, because the 2x2 we know what to do. But going beyond 2x2 and 3x3 and 4x4, I think there's much more work needs to be done. But not so much by merely this criteria, but when you bring in decodability, I think there's a lot more work to be done here. Then, receiver design. So I'm sure I met a couple of people this morning who work in it. Of course, we want ML-like performance. And here again, I always thought that once you have in fact, in IOSPAN, we thought 2x2 MIMO ML is going to be, 64 QAM is very hard to do. So we said we can't do it. So we actually used 3 antennas and did an MMSC to make it look like ML. But, well, it turns out that there were some ideas a few years ago, a year or 2 years ago, which I think all of us now know, where we can use the max log like LLR metrics to actually build an ML system, which is actually very easy to do. So today we can get ML performance for 2 by 2, but beyond 2 by 2, those tricks don't work. And we got to go back to things like lattice embedding and sphere decoding and so on and so forth. Actually, a good group here is actually Professor Bolska's group in ETH in Zurich. Not only they do good theory, but they actually build some chips also. So Europe has been very strong in this whole area. And you know, many of us are building chips in this area, but still none of these are really a perfect solution, because it turns out at the worst case, you have to do a full ML. The only way it really works is that in all these thousands of tones in OFDM, some of them may pay out for you and the search terminates earlier, you get a lot of gain. But some of them will take you back to full ML, so but on average you gain a little bit. And there are also all kinds of new ideas called soft information iterative structures. So you want to sort of iterate, do iterative processing of demapping problems, channel decoding, channel estimation, so lots of new loops. They all get very complicated, but they can buy performance. A lot of research, not in companies, but also in universities, and also something called what they call turbo embedding. So this whole area, I think, is full of nice problems to solve, and full of, I think, several, at least, you know, I would not, at least say once you go beyond 2 by 2 and 3 by 3 by 4, maybe 2 or 3 dB left on the table still to be pulled out by interesting work. Then, of course, pilots, virtualization, MIMO channel estimation. It turns out MIMO is a very bad point of view. If you want to learn the channel, you've got to embed pilots in all these antennas, and that's already pilots are bad because it already takes up overhead. When you have MIMO, it becomes really bad. So there have been lots of ideas as to how to reduce the pilot overhead. One is called virtualization, and all kinds of ideas. There's something called overhead pilots, puncturing, virtualization, overloading. And some of these have got into standards, some of them are not in the standard, but full of nice ideas, nice areas to work on. So what I would generally say to young students here is that if you sit in a university and look at literature and saying, what's my next problem, you'll probably be disappointed. But go and talk to people building chips. They know there's so many problems they have, but they haven't solved. So if you talk to industry, they'll tell you about all the problems that they have to do, which are wonderful theoretical problems to solve. So you need to talk to industry who know where the shoe pinches and where you can actually solve good problems. And this is the big thing which I've been pushing very strongly is the world has been so far FDD, frequency division duplexing, and most cellular systems FDD. But I think TDD is becoming critical, and because of this particular factor, transmit channel state information. This is very, very, very important in MIMO. And I think I see in 20 years from now, the whole world will have gone TDD from where it's all FDD today. And it's critical to improve link budget, and it's also reduce decode complexity. If you know this channel state information, it turns out you can do some coding by which you can actually make the receiver very, very simple. And we go to 4 by 4 and beyond, there's no way I think ML is going to, sphere decoding, lattice reduction is going to do the job. You got to try and get over it by doing what I would call as beamforming and get over the receiver problem. And if you're open loop, you can do it with TDD. TDD gives an open loop method to do a channel transmit CSI. But there are many challenges like sounding and scheduling. And WiMAX is full of these problems. Now we need to clean up things more as you go forward. And it works fairly well for the uplink. And it's useful because uplink is where we actually need this link budget phenomena. So it works quite well in uplink. Closed loop is where the receiver learns the channel and sends it back to you. And a lot of compression techniques using Grassmannian manifolds and all that. This is all part of standards now. But the only thing there's a delay in the loop, and that makes it not so useful for except for slow terminals. But I do think that TDD, I recently saw a paper by Mazzetta at Bell Labs, again, he also believes that TDD is the way to go in the future. So I think we should really, and there are lots of internal issues I've not explained here, which again are good research problems.
What is TDD?
Time division duplexing. So what you do there is you only have one frequency channel. Today in cell phone, what happens is there are actually two channels. One channel is running downlink and one is running uplink. TDD, you only have one channel and you ping pong. So the summary on MIMO is that, it's 17 years young. I think still many challenges across the board to make 4x4 and beyond work. 2x2 today, I think one can argue that we are kind of there. Wireless LAN works there, WiMAX works there, and LTE will work there. But beyond that, I think we're still sort of whistling in the dark to make it really work. Many research problems, some of them are very deeply mathematical. In fact, I'm slowly getting decoupled from most of this. But I think for young people like you, there are lots of nice problems to look at. And important to draw and formulate problems motivated by real system design. Unfortunately, Stanford, where we're not allowed to work on the same problems in industry and Stanford. So my students never touch BC problems or vice versa because of Stanford's IP issues. But in general, I feel that I think if you go to BC, and I do that almost every afternoon, I see so many beautiful problems that can be solved by PhD students. But we don't have the time or money to do it. I'm sure GCT here or Samsung has the same issue. But of course, the big issue is IP. If you solve a problem, who does IP belong to? Those always come up. But there are, I think, many problems here. There are many opportunities here. So with that, I want to spend a few words about my own little philosophy about how things work. And so I wanted to talk about two things which I was in a part of. One was the SPI algorithm. And, the first time we published this was a paper by Professor Kailath, myself, and Richard Roy, very brilliant student of Tom Kailath. And it was really a simple back of the matchbox idea. You can write that equation down in just one line. But it made such a huge impact. I think there were, in my opinion, more than about 700, 800 papers in IEEE. And it was immediately accepted by the research community. I remember, I think 1985 was the first paper, but 1990, I remember in ICASP, which is the International Concept Processing, there were 5 parallel sessions on SPI. I mean, there was nothing but SPI going on in Signal Processing Society. Rapid rise in interest in the academic community, but interest after about 4 or 5 years died away. And it appears to me the applications appear very limited so far. Because, where is it being used? I see, might be used by the defense, I'm not aware of it. But I do see use actually in wireless MIMO. People who actually measure MIMO channels use SPI to localize scatterers for some reasons. And I'm not entirely convinced, but this was a big flash in the pan, and who knows, it might become a very big application in the future, but right now I don't see it. MIMO SM, again, the basic idea, at least the picture was just, so simple. It was so obvious. But it's immediately, in my opinion, rejected by everybody. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And the slow rise in interest in the academic community, but eventually, of course, become a huge academic industry blockbuster. And I think SPI had 900 publications. MIMO has probably more than 10,000 today, and still rising. Still a lot of people work in it. And the applications are huge with impact on billions of wireless devices. So, but both were simple ideas, and probably that has some story to say beyond this thing. So I always say, big ideas are usually very simple and are game changing. I think this sometimes simpler the idea, the better it is, and usually totally obvious afterwards. I think if you look at MIMO, once you know how it works, it'll see so ridiculously simple. And same as Bell multiplexing. We also think, they do not arise in a vacuum, but come from immersion and often from observing the natural world. For example, for me at least, both the initial ideas of SPI came actually from my sonar work, and the work on spatial multiplexing actually came from this experiment we did for DARPA, where purely due to rain, one day it happened that we could make these guys work next to each other, and that triggered some thought, and finally it went to it. Actually, I was already talking to Sergio Verdu. Even turbo codes were not actually discovered by people by fundamental theory. I think it is discovered more computational experiments, and the theory came much later actually. So in some sense, practice and experiment have a lot to teach us, in my opinion. And also, I think comes from holding a problem in your mind for long periods of time. At least SPI, to me, I was holding it in my mind for 3 or 4 months. I knew there were pieces coming together. It finally clicked one day, but it took some time. And therefore I think it's important to focus on these problems for a long, long time. And I think generally it comes from outsiders and relative newcomers. I think, or people come outside. For example, MIMO spatial multiplexing, I knew nothing but wireless 1991. I never worked in it. But somehow, it came because part of the fact that it came to me was because I knew nothing but wireless. So in some sense, I think, this also is true. Even for example, turbo codes, I think Claude was not really my Beru was not really a mainstream coding theorist, and it came to him. So here's a picture I sometimes show my students and talk about innovation. And one can look at research papers and say, okay, they either this should have been complex here and simple. They just got so complex and simple, incremental and game changing. So most of us, write papers. We want to do complex and incremental because first of all, it's incremental and it's already an established area. We take that area and you want to extend it in some way and write another paper. Of course, if we write simple and incremental, we won't get published. The editor will say, this is ridiculous, don't publish, it's not worth publishing. So that is the complex, incremental way I think we tend to get published. But if it's complex and game changing, it's often hard to get to sell the idea. I think if you take MIMO, which it took about 10 years before it really took off. And that happened because not it was complex, but because it needed so many people to come around it. MIMO today, probably, my estimate is the industry has already spent many billions of dollars building it. And I myself, my two companies have spent more than $200 million, leave alone Intel's and Samsung's and LG and all these companies. So it's many billions of dollars. So it doesn't happen, even however good idea, it doesn't happen so quickly. So in order for people to invest in it, they would understand it. And if it's too complicated, they won't understand it, they won't spend the money. So being complex and game changing, sometimes the real winner is always simple and game changing. If it's simple idea, easy to understand, and it really makes an impact, that will ultimately win. And it's not only true in technology, but also in research, in my opinion. And in general, I feel it's, important thing about innovation is willful imagination. You've got to imagine things. If you look at the design of many systems, whether it's helicopters or aircraft, imagination had to run wild, and persistence in failure. People fail again and again and again. It's only people persist who actually succeed. In short, sometimes one has to be foolish to succeed in these things. So with that, I think as my last slide. Thank you.